Hey, Matt.
Hey, Mike.
You want to do a podcast?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it.
Okay.
Welcome to Hacking the Grepson, the award-winning, if there were award shows that we were invited to, podcast about software development and programming and adjacent topics. I'm Mike. I'm here with Matt.
Hello.
That's the guy who just said hello. And today we're going to talk about front-end versus back-end.
All right, so this is our first medical episode.
Yes.
It's all about anatomy.
Yes. And so, hey, if you got some kids listening, maybe we should put them to bed. No, just kidding.
Earmuffs.
Yes. No, of course, we're talking about the difference in how an application...
Where an application is used.
When an application... Why? No. Yeah. It's sort of like, when I think of front end, and once again, I'm a web dev, so I think of these in terms of like websites or web apps, but really any software anywhere. Like this could be anywhere from a web page to an app on your phone to the ATM has a front end that is usually the user-facing part of the program, and it has the back end, which is usually more of how like the code model of how the data is stored and manipulated. If it's in a database, if it's over the network, how the API works. Basically, it's like the guts of a program that if you were to use it without a front end, would largely probably be at a command line prompt, sending a bunch of commands and waiting for returns and then continuing until you're done. Whereas when you think of using an app now, like, I don't know, what's, a browser, the front end is like where you type in the URL, where the web page appears, where you click on things, but the internal part where the websites are modeled, and when you click on something, what happens after that before something else happens, like clicking on a link to go to a new page, all that stuff is the back end part of how both the browser works and how the network works, but is generally not shown to the user, and they don't care how
I would say the entire browser is front end. It's where the page is served from. If there's anything like if you're using like a Rails application, so that where the data is stored for that web page, but the browser itself is the front end application, right?
Okay, sure.
But you could make the argument.
I guess that's more of a client versus server.
So that's how I think of it. So you come from the web dev world. I'm recently dipping my toes in those waters.
Okay. But your gut says front end is and back end is what?
So I think of it in two ways, right? Client server is my immediate gut reaction to front end versus back end, right? My client is the thing that is sitting on your computer that is talking to the thing that's sitting on my computer.
Okay.
Mine's doing all the work, yours is displaying the data. Right? That's how I think. The client gets the data from the back end. Usually the back end is the one with all the smarts, although that's less true these days than it used to be. And then the client makes it happen, right? The other way I think about it, which is similar, is the user interface versus the everything else, right? So if I'm writing an application, the UI or usually the graphical user interface, the GUI, is that's what the client-facing piece of it.
Right.
And I think the way you described web dev, you leaned a little bit more towards the UI versus everything else. Whereas my instinct tends to be more on the client versus server. Like, where do these things live?
Right.
And that gets more muddy because then we have things like the BFF, which is the back end for front end. Which is a back end piece that the front end talks to, and then like it's only there for that piece, and then you have a wider system that's the actual back end that does stuff.
What would be an example of that? I'm curious.
I'm trying to think of one that is something I could talk about.
Just generalize it.
But like I think let's say you wrote a so IMDb exists, right?
Yes.
It's a database.
Internet movie database.
Internet movie database.
Internet movie database. I mean, it's.
I don't know if you've heard of this internet thing. It's a series of tubes.
Yes. I dump my truck.
Yep, exactly. So IMDb exists. It has a database that lives out there.
It's in the name.
I know. And then it has different types of clients. It has different types of clients. It has clients that are like an app on my phone. It has the web page thing. There's probably other ones that I don't know about. Let's say you didn't like the way that IMDb overall displayed anything, and you wanted to do your own thing.
How I interact with it.
How you interact with you, like, I love this data here, but I don't want to use it.
Yeah.
I don't want to use their application. I want to use your own. And you were able to have an API directly into their backend. You're probably not going to call that from your client. If you're doing a lot of manipulation to it, you're probably going to have effectively a proxy that would live behind that it's the one that actually talks out, especially if you have like authentication issues. Your client generally isn't going to do it, so you have your communication to your back end, and then the back end would go and talk to the rest of the stuff.
It sounds a lot like that project you did at work recently, where you were going between source control versions, and you wrote kind of the middle piece.
Yeah, it happens. Yeah, kind of.
I forget what we called that, an adapter or something.
It's an adapter.
Okay.
But basically, it's where you have... It's usually where you have an ecosystem that you're working within, or a larger system, and then you have your own little piece of it. And it could all be in the client, but if you want to take that logic and push it down to the server for efficiency's sake of like processing power, that's a situation where you might have a back end for your front end that then talks to everything else.
Okay.
But I would still consider that part of the back end.
Right. And I think, using IMDb was an excellent example, because it is making me think about how modern software development works now, where if you have data, there are many different ways that you can interact with that data now, or at least like if you're going to be big and used by a lot of people, you are not like, this isn't like the 90s where you would write an application and the front end and the back end would be together in your application that you compile, and it all sits on your computer, and it's a user to their computer to the app.
Right. We didn't use the phrases front end and back end.
Right.
We used UI.
Yes.
And then everything else.
Yeah, everything else. But now,
or the business logic.
Yeah, but now when you talk about like IMDb being this database of information that is specific, it's specific movie database information. Now, I could use a web browser to get to that. I could use an API to get to that.
You could use curl, which is just a command line thing that goes in query that does an HTTP request.
Right, like that could be the front end. My front end to IMDb could be writing curl statements on a command line. Or I could use my phone, which could use a browser or an app.
Right.
But it's all talking to the same back end. These are like different front ends talking to the same back end.
I think it's worth talking about the... I guess
I don't think it's worth talking about.
The design patterns, basically, that go into a web, like a web dev type situation, are different than what you'd have in like a standalone application,
right?
Like a game or whatever.
Although I feel you say that, but when I think about the apps that are on my phone, especially something like, for example, like the app, like the Notes app.
Yep.
The Notes app has an app on my desktop Mac, but it also has an app on my phone.
So that's a really good example of what I was going to talk about. Actually,
they're two different front ends, but they don't have distinct back ends. They're talking to the same back end.
Right. So a common design pattern in web applications is model view controller, MVC. Right.
Yes.
You've got your model, which tends to be your database.
Right.
Your view, which tends to be your front end, and then your controller, which tends to be your back end that sits in between those two things.
Right.
So your view, like you were just describing with IMDb and with the Notes app, you might have multiple of those, but they're all talking to the same controller.
Right.
Right. So the controller plus the database is what most people would probably call the back end. Although I have seen many examples of clients talking directly to the database, which I think is friggin' weird. We don't do that.
Now, give an example, and why do you think that's weird?
I don't like my clients having any sort of business logic in them whatsoever.
Okay.
Because what if I decide to change my database? Now I have to read. Now I have to send out. I either have to keep two versions of my database around. Like I went from Postgres to Mongo or something.
Right.
And now I've got to keep both around until I update every single client in the entire world that exists there.
Right.
Now, less of a problem in web dev. than with like iOS apps, right? Because
if they change iCloud's backend
Right.
structure,
right, and that's where you end up with like the BFFE for backend for front end, or where you end up with like that's where a controller is useful. I like abstractions. That's probably been very clear
that was
to
the word
anybody.
I was thinking of.
Anybody who's listened to any episodes that we've put out here, it's probably very obvious that is the case. I like abstractions for exactly that reason.
Yes.
I have in my career encountered too many situations where people decided that they were going to short circuit the process and go around the controller and go straight from view to model.
Mm-hmm.
And then I needed to change the model and I couldn't. And now my software is a giant mess because I have to. So I don't even my databases are almost never accessible outside of my back end, which is also better for security.
Yeah.
Just generally speaking.
Yeah. Well, and so when I think of front end and back end, and I think about my jobs over the last 20 years, generally I've done probably a lot more front end work than back end work. And when I say front end, that generally means writing the user interface for how a user interacts with our backend. And the backend is usually a PHP based or Ruby based or something like that, usually in a framework like Symfony that talks to a database. So, if it's you run an ice cream store and you have a whole bunch of ice cream types and toppings and stuff, and all that lives in a database, and it's accessed through an API that you write in PHP via Symfony.
Yep.
But you don't want your users to literally sit at a command line and write curl statements to an API because they want to know like what toppings are available and what flavors.
Because that would be a terrible user experience for the average user.
Right. That would be a front end, but a terrible front end.
Usually my first front end when I'm developing something.
Right.
Because I am a back end developer more often than not.
Right. So if you started up an ice cream store and you had to write, the system that interacted with it, you would jump right to the database and the PHP version of it, and
I wouldn't use PHP, but yes.
Well, right.
Yeah, I would write the server first. I probably wouldn't even do the database up front. I design the APIs, right? The application programming interface.
Yeah.
So that's the thing, that my back end service has an API that the front end is calling to do all these things, and that's my abstraction, right? It's the API. I'm saying these are the things you can do with my service,
right?
And here's the data. Here's the way you send me things, and here's how I'm going to send it back.
Right.
Right. And then everything behind that, as far as you're concerned, is a black box.
Right.
Right. I almost never go to the data first because I'm not a data person. In fact, generally speaking, I would have someone do the UI for me, or the front end for me, and I'd have a different person do the data part because I don't like doing any of those.
Yeah.
Although something like Ruby on Rails or Django do a really good job with all of that.
Right.
Like making that type of, they are a framework that just kind of gets you there right off the bat.
Yeah, and I think that's why they are kind of like a revolutionary thing for the web, that they exist, because you can just say like create new Ruby ice cream shop, and it will make the back end and the front end and a usable front end that has views, like you said, that talk to the data and interact with it, like create a new ice cream flavor, create a new order with ice cream, or delete that ice cream flavor because we don't have it anymore, or add more toppings.
I'm more familiar with Django than Ruby on Rails, but I have done both.
Yeah.
I know in Django they actually call them models, views, and controllers. I think Ruby on Rails does as well, but you'll know better than me.
Yes. MVC, model view controller, I first learned that in Ruby on Rails. That was the first time I ever heard that.
It is probably the most ubiquitous design pattern for this type of application that exists.
Yeah.
And it's a good one. Like it's there because it works.
Right. But if you were writing the next, hot game, would it use MVC? Would it use the same kind of, would they think about it as front end and back end?
For a game? It depends on the type of game, I imagine. But
I mean, if you're a 3D shooter,
so some sort of FPS. I don't know. I imagine, so games are weird because they're all about efficiency.
Yeah.
And so they will do weird things like go straight to the database from the client if that's what makes sense. So the design pattern that tends to get used in games is probably a little different than MVC, but I'm not super familiar with it. But if you're doing something like Candy Crush or something, I would be surprised if it's not something, well, that's not really a network program. But assuming that it was, it didn't have a standalone app, and the way most apps work on my phone, is they're just like a thin client on the front, and all the like interesting stuff's being generated on the back.
Yeah.
So like they probably do use MVC.
Yeah. I find that they each have their pros and cons in terms of like how easy or hard they are to work on, and why certain people gravitate towards them over others. I think setting up a front end is a wild adventure.
Yep.
Because you have to deal with users.
Yep.
You have to deal with people, and the way that people interact with computers. There's a whole like study field of human computer interaction.
Yep. I've studied it quite a bit.
Yeah, and it's a whole thing.
It's why I get so mad at bad user interfaces, because I know enough about it to know that that's a bad one.
Yeah.
I can't write a good one, but I know when I'm using a bad user interface.
Yeah. It's an indefinable quality when you use an interface to a program and you're like, this feels bad, this feels wrong, and that's almost that's a separate thing, because you have UI and you have UX. Yeah. UI is like literally like, what are the buttons and links on this web page? UX is like, how does it work for a user and how does it feel?
A fantastic book on this subject that isn't directly related to software but is in a lot of ways very software based is The Design of Everyday Things by Donald Norman.
I've heard.
And there's a sequel of that to it as well. But that talks about user experiences, like things like if you walk up to a door and you can't immediately tell if it's a push or a pull, things like that.
Yeah.
Like if you shouldn't have a handle on the push side. It's confusing to people. You should have a flat plate on the push side, and you should have a handle on the pull side. If you have it on both sides, which they do because capitalism, had to get that one in today.
It's mad.
Then it's confusing.
OOP is good.
So it talks a lot about that kind of stuff. User experience is a thing I'm very passionate about in software development, and that exists everywhere, from the database all the way through to the actual front end UI, right? Because it depends on who your user is, right? When I'm writing back-end software, my user is you as the front end developer more often than not. I take a lot of care in my APIs.
Yeah.
Most people I have experienced in my life do not. They just write something that will work.
Yeah.
And then they expect the client to be smart about it.
Yeah.
User experience
to adapt
is very important to me. And the UI is where you're most likely to see that.
Yeah.
And so the UI engineers often get tasked with being UX engineers, but those are not necessarily the same skill set.
Yeah, I think it's a little fuzzy. I feel like UI is more like how it works, and UX is more how it feels.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
UI is put this button here and make it green. UX is it needs to be green because that conveys that it's working and that it's a safe thing to do and not a red button, which is a dangerous thing to do.
Right. Sort of like with your door example, like that why you should put the plate on one side and the handle on the other side, as opposed to it needs to have a way to interact with it.
Yes.
Besides just pushing it.
Right.
Or something. Yeah. So the front end part, I feel like is much more of it's a harder thing to describe and perfect because of the squishy nature of interaction between humans and computers. Whereas I feel like the back end is closer. It's more like math. It's more logic. It's more like, okay, this doesn't work obviously because X. Whereas explain why this button here doesn't work as well 100 pixels over here is much harder to explain, and there's no like good answer to it. So even though I feel like front end gets it gets a worse rap in terms of what people think of people who work on front end versus back end, like they think they're not as smart or not as clever, but I feel like the field is much more wild and it's actually sometimes harder.
Yeah.
Not to say that backend isn't tough, because designing a database correctly is tough. Yeah. Designing a good API is tough. Designing those controllers that sit between the view and the model is tough.
Yeah. That's the thing I'm good at, and then I can do the other things.
Yeah.
But the thing I am good at and that I like to do is that controller piece, right? It's the brain, right?
Yeah.
And not the face or the
memory.
I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, the database feels like the memory of where all the stuff is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The different parts of the brain. You got the piece where your memory is, and then you got your stuff that actually does all the thinking processes. That's probably the amygdala. Mm-hmm. And then you got your face where all that stuff's being expressed.
Right, yeah.
Right. I like the controller part. I find it easy to think about. It is much more deterministic.
Yeah.
And also, in general, for back-end stuff, you're deploying one version of the back-end, or possibly, if it's at scale, multiple copies of the same thing, but it's under your control.
Mm-hmm.
Front-end is running on your user's system. You don't have control over what browser they're using necessarily. I am old enough, and I know you are as well, to remember like in writing web pages of being like, if it's an Internet Explorer that's version 6 or below, do this. If it's above, then you can do this and do this, because there wasn't consistency. That's gotten better.
Yeah.
But the underlying problem there of that is different. And if it's something like an app that's rolling out to actual machines, you have a little bit more control, but you don't have control of what they installed. So sometimes if you go into an app, it'll be like, you need to update this version because they have taken that control back from you. Right. But in general, that's not a good user experience for people.
Yeah.
You should have backwards compatibility. And so we end up with... I lost my train of thought.
Choo-choo.
Yeah. It went away. But so you end up with less control, I think is the point I was trying to make, in front end. And there's a lot more variability in what you need to account for.
Yes.
I used to be of the opinion that front end development wasn't real software development. I recognized that as a mistake of mine in the past. Yeah. Right? Dunning-Kruger effect. We were actually talking about this right before this episode. Right? I had not done a lot of user interface stuff outside of HTML 1.0. Right? That was when I wrote that. I was a webmaster in 1997. That's what I knew.
Webmaster. Oh,
right?
Yeah.
That was my official title.
Yeah. It was a lot of people's. Yeah.
And like that's what I knew. And honestly, that was barely programming. It was a markup language.
You were marking things up.
Right?
Yep.
But today, front end stuff is complicated. You've got between like JavaScript, TypeScript, that dynamic aspect of it. CSS is its own, like the interplay between all these different technologies is actually really complicated, and I don't think people really appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, and I like what you said about how variable it is, because when I think of a front end, not only do you have to decide how a user is going to interact with your backend, with your data, with their data, there's so many different ways you can do that. And it can be as simple as like, a form they have to fill out. Forms have changed on the web, like, a bunch over like how, what kind of data people can put in, how it's checked, how it's sanitized, like how much data you should let them put in when they put in.
If it should be multiple screens
or not. Yeah. And what basically how, like I said, how it's validated and how much customization you want to give them, like whether like the color scheme or the font size or, the margins or whatever. Like one of the things I've always done when I played a game since I was little is if there was an options screen or a setting, the first thing I go to is like, what can I change?
I'm going to turn on subtitles and I'm probably going to switch the inversion on Y.
Right.
Because that's how because I learned to fly an airplane at one point in time in my life. And so that's how I think about up and down.
Yeah. And I think software is a lot more aware of that people like to be able to do that, and so there is more customizability.
There you go.
But that has to not only be accounted for in the back end, the part where they don't see, because you have to be able to control something that is controllable, but also how much of that do you expose in the front end to the user? Because you want to give them control, but also too much control can be overwhelming. And can be and means they won't even try it, and then you have to think, well, we really want them to do to be able to change this. Everybody's saying like, hey, I can't do this in your app, and I would use it so much more if I could do that. And so being able to build that into the front end, and how do you show that to the user, and how do you make it easy to change, and how do you make it not annoying and not overwhelming? Right. There's so many different, and that's the problem, is that it can be like analysis paralysis because there's too many ways to do it. Yep. And so hopefully you find patterns that other people have found and follow those.
The pattern on the user interface side specifically that I like, I don't even know if it's a pattern, maybe it's a paradigm. I don't know. Is like you have your normal way of doing things, which is usually like the wizard mode, where it's just asking you questions and then it sets it up for you. It does all the smarts. It makes all the decisions for you, and it's just like, what do you like? And then in advanced or expert mode, right?
Yeah.
And I see this a lot in software that engineers specifically are completely in charge of, where they tend to just have that latter one. Here is my configuration screen is a box with every single option and checkbox. Factorio is a great example of something that was clearly written by an engineer. If you go into its configuration, it's
overwhelming.
Yeah. I don't even know where to start most of the times. I have to go look things up online, and that makes me feel dumb, which is a bad user experience.
Minecraft, because I've run a lot of Minecraft servers, the same thing. There's several vanilla Minecraft server config files, which are just text files with lines of options that you can change, and if you don't know, you have to look it up, and then you add on other layers like mods and optimizations, and they have their own configuration, but they're just text files. I remember the first time I got into that was when I tried to configure an Apache web server. Web server config, just a super long text file full of options. Yeah. That's a terrible front-end user interface to modifying a program.
And the only thing worse than that is putting a UI that basically looks exactly like that with all the different fields. And that's your entire thing. I would rather a text file, because at least I can search there.
You can search and you can automate changes to it.
Yes.
So that's why text files are good.
Yeah. But the text file part's fine. But that's the model.
Yeah.
You don't expose that in the front end.
Yeah.
If you want to have a good user experience.
If you want normies to use it.
But in general, yeah, exactly. But in general, like, that's the stuff that, what's the 80-20 rule? Like 80% of users are using 20% of the features, right? That is a great example of that. Is most people that are playing Factorio probably not going in deep into the menus. Well, Factorio is probably a bad example because
it's a terrible example.
It's very engineering heavy audience, I'm sure. But most people are not going to go in and want to mess with all of the twist
even
every
think
single
about
dial.
it. Yeah,
right? I certainly don't. When I'm setting up a web server, I don't want to go and make a bunch of changes to it. I just want it to work.
Yeah,
because that's not the part that's interesting to me. I want to write the code that's doing stuff. I have great ideas. And then I spend 3 days trying to set up the web server, and then I never do anything with it again because I'm angry.
It sounds like you need to learn. I need to introduce you to LAMP or MAMP or WAMP, because those are all like a web server tech stack that you just hit go and it does all the stuff. But yeah, I get what you're saying.
I'm basically building my own right now in that project, which we will eventually talk about on this podcast.
Yes. Yeah.
When I get it past the point it's at now.
Yeah.
Because I don't like most... That's where I run into problems personally in setting these things up. Is I am extraordinarily picky about certain things, and I don't care about most of the rest.
Yeah.
And most of those things, like WAMP is one I've used, and you just, like... It kind of pigeonholes you in certain parts. I'm like, well, I don't want to use... I don't want to do the P part of this. Right? I want to use something else.
Yeah.
And it kind of pigeonholes you in there. And I'm like, I like a little bit of flexibility without too much.
Yeah.
And so the front end requires you to have that so much more than the back end. Back end is, generally speaking, simpler from a deployment aspect, from a CI aspect even, because like the tests you're running, you have... Your interface into it is much simpler in general because you have APIs.
Yeah.
You can mock out the database on the back end, and you can very well test a server. Testing a client is much more complicated because you have to simulate what a user's going to do.
Yes.
And it might not just be click that button. It might be click that button and click that button again really fast. And like, is that a double click? Is that this kind of click? And like, how do you want to respond to it? And like testing that is hard.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so you're basically saying like writing like a unit test is a lot easier than writing like an acceptance test.
Yes.
And yeah, unit test is like, okay, this chunk of code, does it work the way I think it works? Acceptance test is like, okay, if I use the application from the front end, does it do what I think it's supposed to do? It's like I said, it's going from like this very variable, mode down to in the front end, down to the back end, which is less variable and more control and easier to test and deploy, but harder to interface with,
Yeah.
I think, for most people, which is why we have front ends to talk to the back end.
One of my favorite classes I took in college was actually client-server development. It's one of the last classes I took. I may have even taken it in my master's years and I never finished that program. But
Look, I'm just dropping masters. I don't know.
I didn't get my master's,
Okay, wow.
but I did take several overgraduate, whatever the graduate level courses. It sounded wrong. I'm like, that's not right. Master's level courses.
Uber
right?
graduate. Yeah.
But client-server program was really interesting to me. We actually wrote a BitTorrent. Client and server,
nice.
Because that was what was popular at the time.
Yeah.
And Dr. Whitney, I believe, was the teacher. Hello, Dr. Whitney. You're not listening to this.
Shout out.
But he had us write the back end, the server, and the front end, the client. And I learned a lot about that difference in that class specifically, because I'd mostly been writing command line interface application. Everything was one thing. It's like, okay, I have two things. And like versioning is very important there. That's something that leans more heavily on the back end, right? You've got your semantic versioning, and you've got multiple clients out there that are doing, because of the issue I talked about earlier of the distribution. So I might have one that maybe an older iPhone can't run the newest application, so it's still using old one, and I want to still support them. So the back end then has to support multiple APIs or multiple versions of the API. So that becomes really interesting as well. But like I had never really thought about the distinction and where you draw the line between them. And it's a blurry line, right? Like I was saying, I personally do not like when clients go straight to the database. I know that is a very common thing in like a lot of the FANG corporations do that stuff because they're going for the, move fast and break things kind of attitude. And so like, great, I'm just going to access that. And then it's like, I need to change something and now it's a headache. I live my life assuming things are going to go wrong and I have to, and I'm going to have to deal with it. So my maintenance for me is like my most important thing when I'm building code. How much am I not going to have to worry about that? So that's the thing the front end shouldn't have to do is know what the back end is doing and like,
right. That's where
that's the dividing line. And you can move, you can have business logic live up in the front end or in the back end. Often it's split a little bit.
Yeah.
But the problem with putting in the front end is if you need to change it, again, you have that multiple people are running it. Maybe you have different types of clients. I have my web version, I have my app version, I have this.
Right.
Now, maybe I have two different things that are accessing the same data source and I need to change something. That's where that's where people mess up on the front end, as far as I'm concerned, is doing too much there. The front end is already complicated enough.
You want the thinnest client possible.
Me personally, yes.
Yeah.
And there is... And that's a preference.
And that's how it used to be.
I know.
Because we used to use dumb terminals that talk to mainframes, and that's where everything happened. And yours was just a very minimal front end.
And that's when I learned to code, was in that era.
Right.
So,
but then everybody got super computers at home.
Or in our pockets.
Or in our pockets, and so a lot of that moved to the front end.
Right. And then I think now we're starting to see, like you were talking about with TypeScript earlier, is this I hope that was this episode. It might have been the previous episode. But we're seeing this general trend towards like making those more robust and functional as applications that are stable.
Yeah.
Right? It's like now I've got this thing that exists and it works in this way, and I need it to keep working because I have, 1 million users and I don't want to piss them all off.
Right. And so that's why you spend most of your time updating and keeping stable IMDb, the back end.
Yep.
And then the clients are always talking to that the abstraction that knows about the changes, but the front end doesn't need to care about that because it's just showing pictures and movie titles and that's all it cares about.
Yeah, I think that back end for front end thing I talked about is generally speaking, it's like I need some smarts that is so that I can display something in this way and not a general thing about the...
Yeah.
Right. I guess the IMDb example I gave was actually good then.
It was a good example.
It made sense. Yeah. But I there's some incredibly complicated UIs. Like, I mean, Netflix is a good example of that, right? You go to your TV and you're watching it. There's a whole client that's living there and it's doing all sorts of stuff. And then there's the back end, which is doing even more stuff.
Yeah.
But like both of those are complicated, and the interaction with it even is complicated. And then you've got the infrastructure on top of that. Like there's all these different pieces of software development that most people don't think about because what they see is this thing that is on my screen right now.
Yeah, well, I would think that like the majority of the work for something like Netflix would be happening on the front end. Like the client, all the client needs is like data of a movie, and then it's doing all the hard work about how to display it on your device versus something else.
To think about like a social media thing, right?
Yeah.
Because it would be the same deal. I've got like Twitter could be as simple as there's a database on the front end.
Yeah.
It writes into the database, and then I get it back, and I don't even need a controller.
If millions of people weren't using it simultaneously.
Right, because then you need to get API gateways and all that stuff. But with something like TikTok, right, we all know about the algorithm. Mm-hmm. The algorithm is not running on the client.
Right.
Right? The client is...
just displaying what it gets.
It's displaying stuff. And it has its own smarts because you've got filters and other crap that exist on the client that don't need to happen in the background.
Right.
Right? But serving those up, what filters can go out, the algorithm that's determining what you see, that's all happening on the back end.
Yeah.
So there's that balance that needs to be struck of, and with AI we're seeing it more, right? If you have something that's using like an LLM in its user interface, it's probably not doing all that work in the UI. Mm-hmm. It's probably talking to the back end to actually do that piece.
Yeah.
But that line is very blurry, and it has to do, and it moves a lot depending on the speed of our personal devices versus the back end, the speed of our networks, and then the cost to run all those things as well.
Yeah.
And then just what people like to do. Like, I know that you gravitate towards front end because you get that tangible interaction of like, oh, I wrote a thing, I can see it now.
Yeah.
And I love that as well, but I'm not good at writing UIs. So I see it now is a command line thing, almost always. And I write all my code there, and I test it all there, and then I throw a UI in front of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like, there's that...
the front end.
There's that phrase of programmer art. Have you heard that phrase before?
Mm-mm.
Programmer art is... I think it comes from game dev largely, but it's like when you make the game, but it's not pretty yet. It doesn't have like an artist behind it, so the programmer makes art for it, which is generally not as high quality.
Like those engineer forums I was talking about earlier.
Right. But the point of it is that they need a better front end.
Yes.
Which is how someone is playing their game, you know, the parts that they're seeing on the screen and interacting with, but they need something. And so they come up with programmer art because that's part of the front end that has to be there until they can get someone to make it nicer.
So it's placeholder. Like if I'm writing a game, chances are good
yeah.
I don't have an entire sprite sheet going around to run my
or no animation
around.
Or music.
I'm going to draw a box that moves so I can be like, jumps here and I can pick this thing up and it does that. Okay, that's the part. Because that's the part I care about.
You are doing largely the back end work because you have to make something that functions, but nobody will probably even look at your game until they make a flashy front end. Right.
Well, and that's also where you're going to get something like if I think about Metroidvania games, which are one of my favorite genres, you get a fluid...
Except you hate that term.
I don't like that term at all. But some of the games, the more Metroid-y side, have a very nice flow to your movement, and it's pretty smooth. That's much more on the UI than it is on the back end of that. And that, you know, we're talking very much like a single application as opposed to like front end, back end in the general sense of the term. But that same idea is still there. Like that user experience, that user interface, all of the work that is specific to the user of the system.
Yeah.
And that needs to be able to react quickly is happening in the front end.
Yeah.
And the other stuff that can maybe be slower, or like you have a huge file you need to serve or whatever, that's back end stuff.
Yeah. So like back when I used to play MMOs or basically any game where you are switching like an open world and you're switching between sections, like how that's presented to the player is kind of the front end, but what's deciding how to chunk up the world basically it would be the back end. Like in Minecraft, like how far you can see is called the render distance.
Yep.
Obviously what you're seeing is the front end, like the blocks and the animals and whatever, but what's deciding how far you can see and how that's and how performant that is, that's back end.
And what's going on in the place that you can't necessarily see, right? Like if there's
if it's not
if you're digging, right, your front end's only displaying what you can see.
Right.
But you dig through that first thing and like, oh look, now there's gold. Like that decision has to be made somewhere. The generation of it is usually not front end, But like that gets very blurry in like a single application.
Right.
Front end versus back end, to kind of wrap this back up, makes a lot more sense, I think, as terms when we're talking about web development specifically. Your front end is its own piece of the overall system that is the piece that the user is interacting with and then arguably is the part that exists on the client, right? Where that dividing line is a little bit blurry, and then you got the back end, which is definitely where the data is. Anything that you need to persist between sessions is probably going over there, unless it's really small and goes in a cookie, right? Like user settings in general are going to go over there, because otherwise they just disappear if you go to a different system. And then that interface there between that front end and the back end is so critical in making all that work. And good back end developers talk to their front end developers about how they would like that to work. Like, you're going to query this thing 100 times a second. Oh, I didn't realize that. I did not write it that way. So
just as one more example that I remembered from one of my old jobs, where I was working on like a personnel database. I was working on the front end, and other programs were working on the back end. And we had to make a decision about when you first load up the list of users that you get to search through. Initially, for performance reasons, it was like, okay, don't load anything until I send an API request. So basically, show nothing on the front end so that everything will load up immediately, which is a better user experience. But every time they do like a search, it's going to have to send an API request, which is slow, at least in our system. Whereas I ended up making the decision of like, the first time you load this database, it pulls the entire database.
So you're caching it in the client.
Into the client, so that when you do anything after that, it's lightning quick. So it's a terrible initial user experience for a much better user experience after that. That's not always the best decision. That was a choice, that we had to make.
I'll tell you an example. I know we keep trying to wrap this up, and we keep coming up with other examples.
Because it's a good topic.
It really is.
I'm glad I chose it.
Good choice, man. A user experience problem that I experience all the time as a user on the web is specifically a design decision between the front end and the back end, which is you go to a web page and it dynamically loads pieces. And so as you're trying to read something and it's not all loaded there, all the pieces of the page move around, right? Or the most recent one, I actually had to open up a bug with the company that did it, is I was trying to assign a task in our bug tracking system, and I would click it, I'd click the assign button, and it would start with, 2 fields, which basically assigned to me or unknown, and then as I went to click it, it would pop in all of the other people, and this poor guy who happens to have a double A at the beginning of his name kept getting assigned all of my tickets, because that was where it would move things. That is a horrible user experience. That is a combination of problems of the front end isn't being smart about the user experience, and the back end is taking too long to send that data. And it might not be the back end itself, it might be the infrastructure in between of the network. But something in there is making that not work. Because if you had it instantly, it wouldn't be a problem. I click, and it automatically fills. Personally, I would just put placeholders in for everything. But, what do I know?
But that also points out one of the really hard distinctions between UI and UX, because as a UI, it was perfectly functional. As UX, it was horrible. And those are two different things. And one is more about like designing how it works versus like how does it actually feel to use. And you just said it felt terrible, which means, hey, UI people, you need to fix this because the UX is bad.
And UX affects both the front end and the back end, because you have to take into account the overall experience.
The loading and how the selections are made.
Which is why I think I like UX so much, is it's a really interesting, it's such a critical piece, and it's very nebulous.
It is very nebulous. It also, it really hits at another one of those pain points in IT that always bothers me is soft skills. And how they're not valued. Because it's like engineers, at least the people who don't think about these things, like really want to focus on how the tech works, not how people use it and how it affects them. When you're making this tech, presumably, for people to use, and if you don't listen to people who use it and what their praises and complaints are, then are you really doing your job?
That's a really good point. I have so many times in my life been like, that's not how this works when people are using it.
That's not how any of this works.
And then, but what that actually was is it was a signal to me as the owner of that service or whatever to make it support this use case that people, I had something that almost does what they want, and so they started to use it in that way, but it's, taxing the system in a way that you wouldn't know. And that's why communication here is very important.
It is. I agree. And I believe that about wraps up our episode on front end versus back end. It's a huge discussion little area, as you can tell. There are many sub-components, and some of them are fuzzier than others, but hopefully we covered it well enough.
Yeah, and in very clear, short, terse, understandable ways.
Yes. Hopefully your user experience was amazing, as good as the UI you're using to listen to this. If you want to listen to more discussions like this, you can go to hackingthegrepson.com, where we try to put out an episode every other Wednesday. And until the next time we talk at you, we now return you to your regularly scheduled lives already in progress.